The first letter showed up 3 months after I bought the ranch, folded neatly inside a white envelope with red print across the top that read "Final Notice." And I remember standing there in my kitchen holding it while my dog Boone barked at something out by the fence line, because for a solid 10 seconds my brain genuinely couldn't process what I was reading. According to the Cedar Ridge Landowners Association, I owed them $640 in unpaid dues, late penalties, and administrative fees, and if I failed to pay within 30 days, they reserved the right to place a lien against my property. There was just one problem. My ranch wasn't in an HOA. Not, I thought it wasn't. Not, the realtor told me it wasn't. I mean legally, officially, documented in black and white, not in an HOA. I knew that because avoiding an HOA had been one of the main reasons I bought the place in the first damn place. Now maybe some people don't care about that stuff. Maybe they're perfectly happy paying monthly fees so a committee can argue about mailbox colors and grass height. But after 21 years managing logistics operations for a chain of manufacturing companies in Dallas, the absolute last thing I wanted at 45 years old was another layer of people telling me what I could and couldn't do with my own property. I was tired. Not dramatic movie monologue tired, just regular American middle-aged tired. Tired of airports, conference calls, fluorescent lights, and sitting in meetings where 6 people spent 2 hours discussing a problem one competent person could solve in 15 minutes. One Tuesday afternoon, I looked at my calendar and realized I had meetings scheduled every half hour from 7 in the morning until almost 6 at night for the next 11 days straight. And something inside me just quietly gave up. Not in a tragic way, more like a switch flipping off. 6 months later, I bought 117 acres outside a little town called Dry Creek, New Mexico, population maybe 900 if you counted dogs, and people too stubborn to admit they'd already moved away mentally. The property sat about 12 miles outside town, surrounded by rolling grassland and cedar scrub with a shallow creek cutting across the western edge. There was an old stucco ranch house built sometime in the 70s, a rusted windmill that screamed like a dying animal every time the wind picked up, a barn leaning just enough to make you nervous, and a silence so deep at night it almost sounded alive. That was what I wanted. Peace. Not luxury. Not status. Just peace. And for the first 3 months, that's exactly what I got. I fixed fence posts, learned how to unclog irrigation lines, burned the hell out of my hand trying to repair a smoker I bought off Facebook Marketplace from a guy named Randy, who absolutely lied about it being lightly used. Boone spent his days chasing jackrabbits and rolling in things that smelled dead enough to make me reconsider letting him sleep inside. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a beer and watch coyotes move along the ridge under the moonlight while the wind carried that dry desert smell across the property. And for the first time in decades, my chest didn't feel tight all the time. Then that letter arrived. I read it 3 times before I called my attorney, Melissa Granger. Now, Melissa wasn't one of those flashy TV lawyers. No dramatic speeches. No $1,000 suits. She was a compact woman in her late 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had the unsettling ability to make people feel stupid just by quietly asking them to explain themselves twice. She handled my closing paperwork when I bought the ranch, and she was the reason I knew for a fact something was wrong here. "You're sure there's no HOA attached to this property?" I asked her. I could hear keyboard clicks on the other end of the line. "I'm beyond sure," she said. "I reviewed every recorded restriction tied to that parcel. There's an access easement on the north road and utility rights near the creek. That's it. So what exactly am I looking at here?" "A bluff," she said immediately. "Or incompetence. Sometimes those overlap." That made me laugh harder than it probably should have. Melissa asked me to email her a copy of the letter, which I did. And about 40 minutes later, she called back sounding more interested than concerned, which honestly worried me more. "Well," she said, "this is creative." "Creative how?" "They're speaking like an HOA with legal authority while carefully avoiding actually citing any governing document." I leaned against the kitchen counter staring out toward the pasture. Meaning they threatened collections and liens without referencing a single recorded covenant. That's unusual. If they had the authority, they'd cite it immediately. So what do? Simple. Ask for proof. Now here's the thing about people who rely on intimidation. Most of the time they expect compliance, not questions. They expect you to see official letterhead and legal language and immediately panic your way into writing a check. Melissa understood that. Honestly, After 20 years in corporate operations, so did I. Half of authority in America is just confidence wearing a necktie. So I wrote back. I kept the letter polite because polite drives difficult people absolutely insane. I introduced myself as the new owner of the property, acknowledged receipt of their demand for payment, and requested copies of any recorded covenants, deed restrictions, plats, or legal instruments establishing mandatory membership obligations tied to my parcel. I even included the parcel number to make it easy for them. Then I mailed it certified, and for about 2 weeks, nothing happened. Life went back to normal. I repaired part of the south fence line. Boone got sprayed by a skunk and nearly ended our friendship permanently. A retired rancher down the road named Walter Jensen came by one afternoon and spent 45 minutes teaching me why my water runoff system was backward as hell, which turned out to be true. Then the second letter arrived, and that's when I realized this thing was about to become a whole lot bigger than $600. The envelope was thicker this time, more official looking. Inside was a 3-page response from a man named Richard Holloway, president of the Cedar Ridge Landowners Association, and right away I could tell exactly what kind of man he was because the letter had that specific tone people use when they mistake aggression for competence. He never answered my question, not once. Instead, he spent 3 pages talking around it. The association had existed for decades. The roads were maintained collectively. All property owners benefited from community stewardship. Participation had always been expected. Failure to contribute placed unfair burdens on neighbors. On and on and on. But nowhere in that entire rambling mess did he provide the one thing I asked for. No covenant. No deed restriction. No legal authority. Just attitude. And buried near the bottom was the sentence that made me sit forward in my chair. If voluntary compliance cannot be achieved, the association is prepared to pursue all remedies available under state law. Voluntary compliance. I read that line 3 times. Then I smiled. Because people don't usually threaten legal action over voluntary obligations, unless they know the legal obligation doesn't actually exist. And right there, sitting alone in my kitchen with Boone asleep beside the table and desert wind rattling the old windows, I realized something important. This wasn't just some billing mistake. Somebody had been running this game for a long time. And I was probably the first person in years who had stopped long enough to ask them for proof. The next morning I drove into Dry Creek and had breakfast at a little diner off Highway 14 called Maggie's, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like it's been brewing since the Reagan administration, and somehow that makes it better. There were maybe 6 people inside, all over the age of 60 except for a waitress with sleeve tattoos and pink shoelaces who kept calling everybody Hon. Small-town America runs on coffee and people pretending not to overhear each other's business. And by the time I finished my eggs, I'd already noticed 2 things. First, everybody knew everybody. Second, when I casually mentioned the Cedar Ridge Landowners Association, the room got real quiet for about 3 seconds. Not dramatic movie quiet. Just enough. Enough to notice. An older man at the counter glanced over his shoulder at me, then backed down into his coffee like he suddenly found it fascinating. That was my first clue this thing had history. Around noon, I stopped by the county clerk's office. Tiny building, faded flag out front, one overworked receptionist trying to manage phones, paperwork, and what looked like emotional exhaustion. I explained I wanted to search property records connected to Cedar Ridge Landowners Association, and she gave me this look that said, "Oh boy, another one." That was clue number 2. Her name tag, said Denise. "You buying out there?" she asked. "Already did." She nodded slowly. That was it. Just But there's an entire language in rural America built around one-syllable responses. I spent almost 4 hours digging through records. Nothing. No master covenant. No recorded HOA declaration. No subdivision restrictions tying my parcel, or honestly most of the surrounding parcels, to mandatory association membership. What I did find was stranger. Back in the late 70s, the original ranch owners in the area had apparently formed an informal cooperative to share road grading costs after a flood season tore up the dirt access roads. A few old deeds referenced community participation and shared maintenance efforts, but legally speaking it was all soft language, neighborly language, not binding contractual obligations. The whole thing had basically started as a handshake agreement. And somewhere along the line, somebody decided a handshake could become a government if you printed enough threatening letters. I called Melissa from the parking lot. "They don't have anything," I said. I know. You already knew? I suspected. But suspicion and confirmation are different things. So what now? Well, she said calmly. Now they either back down or they escalate. Naturally, they escalated. 3 days later, I got a certified letter from an attorney. That's always cute, by the way. People think adding a lawyer automatically transforms nonsense into truth. Like if bad logic wears a suit suddenly, it becomes intimidating. The attorney's name was Daniel Krebs, and his letter was somehow both smug and weirdly desperate at the same time. According to him, Cedar Ridge maintained authority through something he called implied community obligations arising from continued mutual land benefit. I actually laughed out loud reading that, because that's not legal language. That's decorative nonsense. It's the legal equivalent of a scented candle. But then I reached the bottom of the page. Failure to resolve this matter may result in adverse action affecting title status. There it was again. The threat. That was the moment my irritation turned into something sharper. See, I could tolerate annoying people. I'd spent 20 years in corporate America. I practically had a black belt in tolerating annoying people. But threatening somebody's property based on authority you probably know you don't legally possess, that hit differently. Especially because I started realizing how many people before me had probably folded under pressure. A retired couple, a widow, somebody overwhelmed by legal language. $600 turns into $1,200. $1,200 turns into years of quiet compliance. Not because they owed it, because they were intimidated. That bothered me more than I expected. Melissa drafted the next response herself. Now when Melissa wrote a letter, it felt less like correspondence and more like a very polite execution notice. No wasted words. No emotional language. Just facts arranged with surgical precision. She demanded they produce the recorded legal instrument authorizing mandatory assessments against my property. She pointed out their repeated threats regarding liens and title impairment absent demonstrated authority. And then, beautifully, she mentioned that knowingly asserting invalid claims against real property could potentially constitute slander of title under New Mexico law. That changed the temperature immediately. A week later, my phone rang while I was repairing the windmill gearbox. Mr. Mercer? Voice smooth. Controlled. Expensive. This is Richard Holloway. I wiped grease off my hands with a rag and leaned against the ladder. The HOA president. A tiny pause. The association president, yes. Funny thing about power, people reveal themselves in microscopic ways. Richard corrected titles the way insecure men adjust cufflinks. What can I do for you? I asked. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. No, I said. I think we got off on exactly the right foot. I asked for proof, and your organization threatened me instead. Silence. Wind creaked through the old blades above me. Finally, he sighed. You're benefiting from infrastructure the association has maintained for decades. Then charge voluntary membership dues. We can't sustain operations voluntarily. And there it was. The first honest sentence anybody from that organization had spoken. I sat down on the tailgate of my truck. So this is about money. It's about fairness. No, I said quietly. Fairness is when people agree to the rules before you bill them. Another pause. You're new here, he said. Maybe you don't fully understand how communities survive out here. I remember staring out across the property while he said that, watching Boone sprint after some invisible enemy through the tall grass. You know what's interesting? I told him. Everybody who actually lives out here has been pretty welcoming so far. The only people threatening me are your organization. That landed. You could feel it. Richard's voice hardened slightly after that. You need to understand something, Mr. Mercer. A lot of people around here are tired of outsiders moving in and refusing to contribute. And finally, I understood what this was really about. It wasn't just dues. It was resentment. The old ranch families had watched wealthy buyers from Dallas, Phoenix, Denver, wherever, come in buying vacation land and investment properties while contributing nothing to the local systems that kept rural life functioning. Roads, water runoff management, emergency access, fence coordination. Honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. The problem was Richard had taken a real frustration and wrapped it in fake authority. That's dangerous. Because once people start believing good intentions justify dishonest methods, things go sideways fast. I'm happy to contribute voluntarily, I said. I'm not paying money because somebody sends me fake legal threats. His voice turned cold then. You may regret making this difficult. And there it was. The little dictator finally stepping fully into frame. I smiled despite myself. I think, I told him, you already regret it. Then I hung up. That conversation sat with me all night. Not because I was scared. Honestly, by then I was more annoyed than worried. But because for the first time I could see the emotional machinery underneath the conflict. Richard wasn't cartoon evil. He genuinely believed he was protecting the community. The problem was he also enjoyed power. And once people start enjoying authority, they become real talented at convincing themselves the rules don't apply to them. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A man named Eli Navarro knocked on my door. He was somewhere in his 70s, sunburned neck, old denim jacket, hands rough enough to sandwood. He introduced himself as one of the original property owners from back when Cedar Ridge was still mostly cattle land. You the guy fighting Richard Holloway? He asked. Word travels fast in small towns. I guess so. He nodded toward the porch. Mind if I sit a minute? We sat outside for almost 2 hours while the sun dropped behind the ridge. And that conversation changed everything. According to Eli, the association had started out honestly. Back then, everybody chipped in because everybody knew each other. If the road washed out, people grabbed shovels. If somebody's cattle got loose, neighbors helped round them up. Nobody needed contracts because trust was the contract. But over time, things changed. Families sold land. New money came in. People stopped knowing each other. Then Richard Holloway arrived about 7 years earlier after retiring from commercial real estate development in Scottsdale. Smart guy, organized guy, ambitious guy, and according to Eli, a man absolutely convinced that every problem in life could be solved through control. He kept saying we needed structure. Eli told me. Said the old ways weren't sustainable anymore. To be fair, I said, he's not completely wrong. Eli nodded slowly. No, he ain't. That was the complicated part. Richard had identified a real issue. But instead of building legitimate agreements, transparent memberships, legal frameworks everybody consented to, he skipped straight to enforcement. Because enforcement is faster. And some people mistake fast for effective. Eli stared out toward the pasture for a long moment before speaking again. You know why he's really mad at you? Because I didn't pay? No, Eli shook his head. Because you asked him to prove himself. That line hit me harder than I expected. Because deep down, that's what this whole thing had become. Not a money dispute. A legitimacy dispute. Richard had spent years operating like an authority figure nobody questioned, and suddenly some new guy from Texas showed up asking for paperwork that threatens people in ways they don't always handle gracefully. Then Eli told me something that made my stomach turn. You ain't the first one they pressured, he said quietly. Couple folks paid just because they got scared. How many? He shrugged. Enough. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about older landowners getting those letters, seeing legal threats, panicking and paying money they didn't actually owe. Not because they were weak. Because most people assume official-looking authority is legitimate. That's normal. And suddenly this thing became personal in a way it hadn't before. Not because of $600. Because I hate bullies. Especially educated bullies. The next morning I called Melissa and told her I wanted to go further. How much further? She asked carefully. I want every public record tied to Cedar Ridge. Silence. Then I heard her exhale slowly. Oh, she said. Now you're motivated. I think they've been doing this for years. Another pause. Well, she said finally, then let's find out exactly how long. And that's the moment this stopped being a disagreement and turned into an investigation. Over the next month, my dining table stopped looking like part of a home and started looking like the evidence room in a low-budget crime documentary. Stacks of county filings, tax records, corporate registration printouts, old plat maps, handwritten notes, coffee cups everywhere. Boone had developed a habit of sleeping underneath the table like he understood something serious was happening and wanted moral support privileges. Melissa and I dug through everything. And once we started pulling on the thread, the whole thing unraveled faster than either of us expected. First discovery, Cedar Ridge Landowners Association wasn't even in active standing with the state anymore. Their nonprofit registration had lapsed almost 3 years earlier, which doesn't automatically dissolve an organization, but it absolutely complicates your ability to posture like a fully functioning legal authority. Second discovery, there was still no recorded authority tying mandatory dues to most of the properties they built. None. Not hard to find. Not unclear. just flat out non-existent. And third, we started finding people. People who had paid. A retired couple named Don and Marcy Wilkes had been paying almost $800 a year for over a decade because they thought they had no choice. An older widow named Irene Wallace admitted she'd once skipped medication refills for a month because she was afraid the association would take legal action against her property if she missed payment. That one made me physically angry. There's a specific kind of rage that comes from realizing ordinary decent people got pushed around because somebody knew they wouldn't fight back. I remember sitting in my truck after speaking with Irene, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. Not because Richard Holloway was stealing millions. Because intimidation scales. Small abuses become normal when nobody challenges them. And honestly, that's true in a lot more places than HOAs. Melissa eventually looked at me across her office desk one afternoon and said, "You realize if this escalates publicly, it's going to split that community right down the middle." I know. You still want to continue? I thought about Eli. About Irene. About all those years of quiet compliance. Yeah, I said. I do. The breaking point came 2 weeks later at a special association meeting held inside the Dry Creek Community Center. Now, technically, I wasn't even a member, which made the invitation interesting all by itself. But apparently enough rumors were circulating by then that the board decided they needed to address the situation publicly. Melissa came with me. Richard Holloway stood near the front of the room wearing a pressed blue button-down shirt and the expression of a man trying very hard to remain in control of a situation already slipping through his fingers. There were probably 40 people there. Ranchers, retirees, a few newer property owners, folks sitting stiff in folding chairs holding styrofoam cups of coffee while tension floated around the room thick as humidity before a storm. Richard opened the meeting with a speech about community cooperation and shared obligations. And honestly, if you didn't know the backstory, he sounded pretty convincing. That's the dangerous thing about confident people. Confidence sounds a lot like truth until somebody asks for documentation. Finally, Richard opened the floor for questions. I stood up, and man, you could feel the room tighten. Can you provide the recorded covenant establishing mandatory dues authority over non-member properties? I asked. Simple question. Clean question. The kind of question with either a real answer or no answer at all. Richard adjusted his glasses. The association has historically operated under implied participation agreements benefiting all landowners. Melissa interrupted before he could finish. With respect, she said calmly. That's not what he asked. You could hear chairs creak. Everybody's suddenly very awake now. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. The legal framework here is complex. No, Melissa said. Actually, it's extremely simple. Either recorded authority exists or it does not. Dead silence. One of the older ranchers near the back raised his hand slowly. Richard, he said, do we actually got legal authority or not? And right there, that was the moment. The moment the performance cracked. Richard looked around the room and realized something terrifying had happened. People were no longer automatically accepting his version of reality. That changes everything. He tried pivoting into fairness again. Road maintenance. Shared benefit. Community survival. And honestly, parts of what he said were reasonable. That's what made the whole thing messy. Because this wasn't a story about pure villains and innocent saints. The roads did need maintenance. The area did need coordination. The community genuinely benefited from collective effort. But good goals don't magically legalize bad methods. Finally, Melissa placed a thin folder on the table in front of the board. Inside were copies of the county record searches, corporate registration documents, property filings, everything. You threatened liens against properties, she said evenly, without recorded authority supporting those claims. My client has thus far chosen not to pursue litigation. But continuing these collection practices after this point would create very serious exposure. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then something happened I honestly didn't expect. An older woman sitting near the side wall stood up slowly. Her name was Ruth Delaney. I'd seen her once at the diner, but never spoken to her. I've been paying dues 15 years, she said quietly. Are you telling me I didn't legally have to? Nobody answered. Because nobody could. And suddenly the room changed. Not explosively. Not dramatically, just emotionally. You could feel people recalculating years of assumptions in real time. Richard looked exhausted all at once. For the first time since I met him, He stopped sounding like a man delivering authority and started sounding like a tired human being cornered by consequences. "We were trying to keep the community functioning," he said. And weirdly enough, I believed him. That was the uncomfortable truth underneath everything. Richard Holloway wasn't some mastermind criminal. He was a man who convinced himself the ends justified the means. A lot of damage in this world gets done that way. The meeting lasted another hour and a half. By the end of it, 3 major things happened. First, the board formally withdrew all collection threats against non-member properties pending legal review. Second, an independent attorney specializing in rural land associations would be hired to restructure the organization legally and transparently. And third, Richard Holloway resigned. Not dramatically. No yelling. No slammed doors. Honestly, that almost made it sadder. He just stood there looking older than when the meeting started and said, "I think the community may need different leadership moving forward." Then he sat down. That was it. Afterward, people lingered outside in little groups under the parking lot lights, talking quietly, while desert wind rolled across the empty baseball field nearby. Eli found me standing beside my truck. "Well," he said, "you sure stepped in it." I laughed for the first time all night. "Feels weirdly terrible, honestly. Means you're probably still decent," he said. That stuck with me, because victory in real life rarely feels clean. There's no movie soundtrack. No perfect ending where the bad guy gets dragged away and everybody cheers. Just consequences. Messy human consequences. Over the next year, the association rebuilt itself from scratch. Voluntary memberships. Transparent accounting. Actual legal agreements. No threats. No fake authority. And surprisingly, most people still joined. Because it turned out folks were willing to contribute when they were treated honestly. Funny how that works. About 18 months after the whole mess started, I signed up too. Not because anybody pressured me, because by then I actually knew my neighbors. Eli still came by sometimes with terrible advice and excellent whiskey. Ruth Delaney started dropping off homemade peach cobbler every few months for reasons nobody fully understood. Walter Jensen still insulted my irrigation system every chance he got, though admittedly less often because he'd finally run out of obvious flaws to criticize. It became a real community again, not one built on intimidation. One built on trust. And I think about that a lot now when I sit out on the porch at night watching Boone asleep beside the steps while the windmill finally turns smooth and quiet after all the repairs it took to get there. Because this whole thing taught me something bigger than property law. People confuse confidence with legitimacy all the time. Somebody uses official language, speaks aggressively enough, prints a logo on letterhead, and most folks assume authority must be real. But authority without transparency is just pressure. And pressure works best on good people. That's the part one still can't shake sometimes. How many people paid simply because they didn't know they were allowed to ask questions? How many Americans spend their lives intimidated by systems that only function because nobody challenges them? And look, I'm not saying every HOA is evil. Some communities genuinely need structure. Shared maintenance matters. Rural infrastructure doesn't magically maintain itself. But if somebody claims power over your property, your money, or your rights, they should be able to prove that power clearly, immediately, and legally. If they can't, that should tell you something. Richard Holloway moved away about a year later. Last I heard, he bought property somewhere outside Prescott, Arizona. Eli says he still talks about Cedar Ridge like he got betrayed by ungrateful people. Maybe part of him even believes that. Honestly, maybe part of him isn't entirely wrong. That's the uncomfortable thing about real life. Sometimes everybody's a little right. Sometimes everybody's a little guilty too. But I still think about Irene Wallace skipping medication because she was scared of legal threats that never should have existed in the first place. And for me, that settles the argument. Anyway, that's my story. So now I'm curious what you think. Was Richard Holloway trying to protect the community the only way he knew how? Or was he just another guy who got addicted to power and stopped caring whether the rules actually supported him? And if you were in my position, would you have fought it? Or just paid the dues and moved on? Let me know in the comments. Because honestly, after everything that happened out there in Dry Creek, I still don't know if there was ever a perfect answer.